Look, could I recommend to you too that you, of course, go to the opinion section on the platform app. Got a piece up from Geoffrey Miller, who is part of the Democracy Project, which is a group of academics who look at issues around democracy and truth. And Geoffrey's written a really interesting piece about our relationship with South Korea, which I will be brutally frank, I don't think about much. But Penny Henare, government minister's been up there, and Geoffrey said, well, what's he doing there and what's going on? It's actually very, very interesting, though you might not read it in mainstream media. So joining us on the line now from the Democracy Project is its international analyst, writer on current New Zealand foreign policy and related geopolitical issues, Geoffrey Miller. Geoffrey's lived in Germany and the Middle East. He is a learner of Arabic and Russian. Geoffrey, welcome to the program. Lovely to have you with us again, mate.
Good morning, Sean.
Why the emphasis? Why did you decide to write about South Korea?
Well, I just thought it was very interesting, Sean, that Penny Henare was going up to South Korea, and we hadn't really read anything about it. So he was at what's called the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last weekend, which is a big defence ministers summit. And then the press release said he was going up to South Korea for 3 days. And the only thing we know that he's been doing up there is visiting New Zealand troops, of which there are only 12. I'm curious. I would love for you to get him on the platform and have a chat to him and find out what he's actually been doing in his 3 days up there, because from what I can see, it shouldn't really take 3 days just for a quick meet and greet with troops. While that's very valuable, I kind of think there's probably a little bit more to it. And I think it comes in the context of New Zealand is becoming a bit closer with countries like Korea that are becoming a bit more pro-Western and pro-US in their foreign policy at the moment, and seeking to counter China. So that's really what I think it's about.
Okay, so it is about this wider geopolitical tension that is growing in our part of the world, because to be honest, I think most New Zealanders think about Korea and they think about MASH. Alan Alda is is what comes to mind. Give us some history, your understanding of our relationship with South Korea. What has it been based on, and what's it like right now?
Well, if you go back to the Korean War, Sean, 6,000 New Zealanders served over there, and it's never really got the recognition that it deserves. It's often called the Forgotten War, the Korean War, and 45 New Zealanders died, and yet there weren't the first memorials to that war until the 1990s. So it is something that's definitely worth thinking about in terms of New Zealanders' service up there in Korea in K-Force. And in more recent years, a lot of trade with South Korea. They're actually our 5th biggest export market and our 6th biggest two-way trade partner. You wouldn't think that, would you? But there's been an economic miracle in South Korea since the war. They were one of the poorest countries. They were an aid recipient. And yet, since 2009, they've been a net aid donor. One of the few countries in the world that have moved from being a recipient of aid to a donor. So it's been a remarkable transformation. And if you just look at their per capita GDP, even in the last 20 years, they've gone up from around $12,000 per capita to around $30,000 US. New Zealand's about 40,000. So while New Zealand's been stagnating, Korea's been making great strides, and we've benefited from that by selling them a lot of dairy, aluminium, wood are the chief exports that we send there, and they send a lot of vehicles our way.
Okay, so it's mainly cars. It's the new
mainly
car
cars.
brand. Yeah,
mainly cars and electronics, these kinds of things, obviously, that Korea produces.
Yeah, and Samsung, Paul just mentioned. All right, so look, generally if you think of power blocks or areas of influence, my rather naive and non-academic mind thinks, so you pick sides, we go with the Americans and everything, and the Americans kind of dictate to their friends and allies what the overall strategic direction might be. But I'm wondering if Penny Henare going up there suggests that there's a new way of doing things, that is where the constituent members of a geopolitical power bloc themselves, through cooperation and dialogue, exercise perhaps more control than they might have in a more top-down power structure.
Yes, well, look, I think New Zealand fits into a grouping of countries along with Korea, which are not in the top echelon, they're not in the top tier, where you would put Australia, the US, Japan, and those countries that signed up to, Australia and the US and the UK signed up to AUKUS, for example. Australia is also part of the Quad grouping, which includes India, Japan, Australia, and the US. New Zealand is not in one of these top-level alliances. Look, we're not even a formal US ally, although you would be forgiven for thinking so if you look at the joint statement that was signed when Jacinda Ardern met with Joe Biden in the White House. The statement that was put out makes us seem like a US ally, but we're not. But we do fit in quite well with countries like Korea, which are in sort of a second-tier grouping that have been edging closer towards the West. And South Korea's got a new president, President Yoon. He hosted Joe Biden recently. He's much more interested in containing China and countering China and working alongside the US. Remember, South Korea's big focus historically has been on North Korea, which is a nuclear armed power, very dangerous state to its north, obviously. And so they've been keen to work with China because of the influence it has on North Korea. I think that's changing a little bit now, and President Yoon has got some bigger ambitions, and he says that he wants to make South Korea into a global pivotal state. And the way he wants to do that is to become a bigger player in this wider geopolitical game, seeking to counter Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific.
Generally, and I know you can handle this questions because it's your area of expertise. Are countries now taking sides in this? Would you call it, a lukewarm diplomatic war between China and the United States? Are people recognising that they're having to declare in one way or another, or nations are having to declare in one way or the other, which side of this they're on?
Well, that's certainly the theme this year, Sean, and ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, we've seen this geopolitical polarisation, and countries are being called upon to pick a side. I feel the climate is a bit like after 9/11, where you're either with us or against us, and New Zealand has been caught up in that. New Zealand, for historically, culturally, has been part of the West, but for trade reasons has had a lot to do with China. 33% of our exports go to China. They're by far our biggest trading partner. And I talked about Korea being our fifth biggest export market. Well, we export 10 times what we do to Korea to China. So it just shows the gulf there. And we're just now caught up in this new world, this new Cold War, if you like, between Russia and China on one side and the West on the other. And Joe Biden speaks a lot about unity and working together, and he wants very much New Zealand on the Western side. The problem is our trading position doesn't really reflect that. So we're kind of caught in the middle here.
Do we need to pick sides? Do we need to pick sides?
Well, I think we'd probably be better off going in some kind of mediation role in the middle, and if we could play an intermediary role and try and dial down the tensions. Well, whatever you call it, I think you can be on one side but still play that role of intermediary, Sean. If you look at Russia and Ukraine, you had countries like Turkey and Israel fairly early on in the war were playing that role. Now, look, Israel is a strong US ally, and Turkey's a NATO ally, and yet they could do it. I think New Zealand could still be friends with the West and good friends with Australia and allies with Australia, very good friend of the US, and could still play this intermediary role and try and bring down the tensions, because I worry that we're on this slow march to war in the Indo-Pacific, and we should not see that as an
Well, hang on, Geoffrey. Are you just telling me we are on a trajectory that could lead to military conflict between China, either directly between China and the US, or proxy military conflict in our part of the world?
Yes, because that's the way things are. Every week we're seeing escalations in the rhetoric and in actions. You've seen that this week over the Taiwan Strait. So, China has, said, look, this is our territory. The US has said, back off, you're being coercive and aggressive. The rhetoric each week keeps escalating. And while this keeps going on, the risk of war through accident or by design just keeps increasing. Now, whoever's in the right or wrong here, just put that to one side for a moment. We need to bring down the tensions, and you're only going to do that through dialogue and through talking through the differences, because that's the only alternative. So, Nanaia Mahuta had a meeting with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, by Zoom on Monday. I think that's very positive. At least they've had some kind of discussion. And it was very interesting that Nanaia Mahuta asked for that meeting. It was not requested by the Chinese side. It was requested by the New Zealand side. But the Chinese accepted it. And they put out an account of the meeting, which I thought was fairly generous to New Zealand. Remember, New Zealand had just issued
there'd been that spat, hadn't there? There'd been that sort of diplomatic spat.
New Zealand had issued a very hawkish joint statement with the US, which called out China on all kinds of issues, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea, and so forth. It was more hawkish, Sean, than the joint statement that President Yoon issued when Joe Biden came to visit South Korea. And South Korea is a US ally. New Zealand is not. So I think it's remarkable, that joint statement that New Zealand put out with the US. But China's willing to take New Zealand's calls at the moment. I think that's a really valuable position to be in. Other Western countries don't have that ability at the moment to talk to China. You're not seeing meetings with Anthony. Yeah.
We could leverage that. Look, I want to go back to this issue and to the statement that was issued and the attitude of the Prime Minister during her visit to the United States. I talked to Jane Kelsey, who also made the observation that she thought the Prime Minister had painted us into a far more extreme and American-aligned position, and she appeared to do so without any consultation, without any preparation, and without any real thought going into it. Was that a mistake by the Prime Minister? Was it a genuine mistake? Did she misspeak? Or did she not know what the hell she was doing?
I think we've got a very reactionary foreign policy at the moment. I don't think we've got really a long-term plan. I think part of the problem is the fact that we've got a part-time foreign minister, effectively, with Nanaia Mahuta, and that's where a lot of the detailed work goes on. So you've got Jacinda Ardern doing these big-picture events, and Western partners are asking her to do stuff, and the easiest decision is to say yes. So, look, I think it's a popular position as well. I think you look where New Zealanders are at, when you look at New Zealanders' attitudes to Russia's war on Ukraine, they rightly say it's brutal, it's terrible, it's awful. We need to do our bit to stop that.
Yeah.
And we need to join with our partners and, supply weapons. I think most New Zealanders would probably be on side with the decisions that have been made immediately over Ukraine. But we've got to realise that it's more than just this immediate conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's about this overall trajectory of New Zealand foreign policy. And given our reliance on China, we just need to think very carefully here, have a debate.
Okay. Do you think the Prime Minister is thinking carefully or not?
Well, I think, as I said, I think she's very much in a reactionary mode where she just responds to pressure.
So that's
from
That's
Western
a no
partners.
to she's not thinking carefully. Is she thinking carefully? All right, and you've described Nanaia Mahuta as part-time. Do we need, therefore, for Nanaia Mahuta to either divest herself of her other roles than foreign affairs, or to find someone? And I guess the name that springs to mind, because he's the person who fixes everything, does Chris Hipkins need to become the foreign minister, or do we need someone else to be our Minister of Foreign Affairs?
Oh, there's an idea. We could have Chris Hipkins doing all three, couldn't he? He could be Education, Police and Foreign Minister. Probably.
Well, he is Super Minister, isn't he?
Yeah, he's Super Minister. But no, look, in all seriousness, we do need a full-time Foreign Minister. The pace of geopolitical change at the moment is just so rapid that it's hard for an analyst like me to keep up. I don't know how Nanaia Mahuta manages. Look, she's
maybe she doesn't manage.
Minister. And look, let's put her politics to one side, but she is very hard-working on issues that she believes in. It's just that she cannot spare a lot of time for foreign affairs because she's tied up with three waters in the local government. So that question needs to go back to Jacinda Ardern. Jacinda Ardern is the woman who appoints her and appoints all their ministers. She had a chance this week to shuffle the cards. She chose not to do that with Nanaia Mahuta and kept her on in the same position. She gave her an additional associate minister in local government, Kieran McAnulty, ostensibly to take some of the workload off her in local government. But I just can't see that really happening in a great way, because Mahuta is still the face of these reforms, and I doubt Kieran McAnulty is going to be doing a lot of the work for it. So we're going to continue with this part-time foreign minister theme, and I just think it's untenable.
Wow. And look, I'm sort of concerned now, and it's something I had not looked at in the immediate aftermath of the cabinet reshuffle. What about, let's continue the conversation. Just want to take you somewhere else if you're comfortable. What about foreign affairs, the bureaucracy, our diplomatic corps itself?
Well, I think diplomats do a pretty good job. I think New Zealand does pretty well out of its diplomats, but you need leadership from the top. Otherwise, you will just get this bureaucratic drift. So, that's why you need a strong foreign minister. Winston Peters was a very popular foreign minister with the MFAT staff, because he really backed them, and he was a big fan of career diplomats. Winston Peters has railed against the idea of political appointments, for example, and you're seeing that debate at the moment over Trevor Mallard, who's in line to get the Ambassador to Ireland job. So, I think you look at Winston Peters, he was a part-time foreign minister in many ways as well, because he was a campaigner and deputy prime minister and in doing everything else, defending New Zealand in the media. But he did do a good job as foreign minister overall, and he was somewhat ahead of the curve with the need for focusing on the Pacific, which we're doing now. So lots and lots of changes going on at the moment, and I think it just all adds to the fact that you need someone who's on the job full time, and that's just what we don't have right now.
Geoffrey, the other thing about foreign policy and diplomacy is often that it is not played out in the public eye. Might there be a grand plan behind all of this by New Zealand's foreign affairs officials that we're not aware of?
There could be. We had that meeting yesterday between Penny Wong, the Australian Foreign Minister, and Nanaia Mahuta, and we got a press conference that talked a lot about working together in climate change. I'm sure there was a lot more discussed in that meeting, and I'm sure what's really going on behind the scenes is that they're cooking up a plan to put to the other Pacific countries at the Pacific Islands Forum, which will be taking place from the 12th to the 14th of July in Fiji. So they're trying to come up with an alternative vision for Pacific countries to sign up to compete with China, which came up with its own multilateral plan, which Pacific countries didn't sign up to, but they did show some interest in. And I think China will come back and keep coming back with plans. There is a race on at the moment to come up with some kind of alternative proposal. And these Pacific countries, they want money fundamentally. So I think it's whoever's going to get the bigger checkbook out can give these countries the greater amount of money that's probably going to win at the end of the day. So Western countries are probably just going to have to pay up if they want Pacific countries on their side. And I think it's a good thing. If you're a Pacific country, it's a bonanza at the moment. You're suddenly the object of desire, and they're probably going to do very well out of.
Well, I jokingly suggested last week, Geoffrey, that we should offer Whangarei as a deep-water military base to either China or the United States, depending on who would build more infrastructure for us. Do you think if we do...
Well, we certainly need more innovative ideas at the moment. I think this is the time you need to put everything on the table and try and work out the ideas. And yes, your idea included. Let's put it all on the table and may the best ideas win at the moment. But we need a strategy, Sean, and that's what we're lacking. There's the old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And I feel that's where we're at the moment with New Zealand foreign policy. We had this clear, independent foreign policy strategy for 30 years, trying to keep everyone happy, trading with China, getting on well with Australia, patching up our relations with the US. But suddenly that strategy seems to have gone a bit by the wayside. And we're responding to various photo opportunities. I think we really need to rethink that.
Geoffrey, absolutely fascinating chat. It developed a little bit from what's going on with New Zealand and South Korea. Thank you for your time, and we will talk again soon. That is Geoffrey Miller. He's the Democracy Project's international analyst, and he writes on current New Zealand foreign policy and geopolitical issues.